You don't live in an expensive economy, you live in a calculated one. The price you see isn't random. It isn't inflation, it isn't supply and demand. It's a number chosen after an algorithm studied your habits, your location, your device, your patience, and your past decisions. Two people can stand side by side, search the same product at the same moment, and pay completely different prices. Quietly, legally, instantly. This isn't the future of pricing, it's already here. And once your value becomes the product, nothing ever gets cheaper again. For most of modern history, prices were public, static, and impersonal. A product had a cost, a margin, and a single number attached to it. If 10 people walked into the same store, they paid the same price. That assumption shaped how trust worked in markets. What has quietly changed is not just how high prices are, but how they are decided. The shift begins when pricing stops responding to products and starts responding to people. This is the moment market prices collapse into profile prices. Instead of asking, what does this item cost to produce and distribute? Modern systems ask a different question. How much can this specific individual tolerate before walking away? Once that question becomes central, fairness disappears from the equation. Data is the raw material that makes this possible. Every click, pause, scroll, search repetition, and abandoned cart becomes a signal. Location data estimates income bands. Device type signals purchasing power. Time spent hesitating signals urgency or vulnerability. Algorithms combine thousands of these inputs to estimate a private number, your personal ceiling. What you see on the screen is not the price of the product. It is a stress-tested figure designed to extract the maximum amount without triggering resistance. This is not theoretical. Consulting firms openly quantify the payoff. McKinsey estimates that AI-driven pricing systems can raise corporate revenue by up to 15% without adding a single new product or customer. That increase does not come from efficiency in production. It comes from precision in extraction. When multiplied across groceries, transportation, housing-related services, travel, and digital commerce, that percentage becomes hundreds of billions of dollars quietly transferred upward. The illusion that markets still function competitively relies on consumers believing prices are comparable. That illusion breaks once prices diverge at the individual level. Investigations by Consumer Reports found differences as high as 116% for identical online products, depending solely on zip code. No supply shock, no cost difference, just geography acting as a proxy for income. When price discovery becomes personalized, comparison shopping collapses. You are no longer choosing between sellers. You are negotiating with an algorithm that already knows your limits. This is where emotion enters the system, not from consumers, but from code. Behavioral pricing models are designed to exploit impatience, fear of missing out, and urgency. Someone searching repeatedly sees higher numbers. Someone checking late at night is flagged as time-constrained. Someone browsing from an affluent area is assumed to be resilient to price increases. Each signal nudges the final number upward by a few percent. Individually, the change feels invisible. Structurally, it rewires the economy. Even small adjustments compound aggressively. A 6% increase here, a 10% premium there, repeated across daily necessities, quietly reshapes household budgets. Over a year, a family spending $40,000 on essentials can lose $2,000 to $4,000. Not because prices rose uniformly, but because algorithms decided they could endure more. This is why cost of living pressure feels personal. It is personal. What makes this transformation especially destabilizing is its silence. There are no posted explanations, no receipts showing alternate prices, no way to prove discrimination in real time. Unlike traditional inflation, which appears in headlines and indexes, profile pricing hides inside interfaces. It does not announce itself. It simply normalizes higher numbers one screen at a time. This evolution sets the stage for everything that follows. Once prices can adapt to individuals rather than markets, volatility becomes acceptable. Consumers are conditioned to expect fluctuations, to stop questioning sudden increases, and to internalize blame. That psychological reset is critical because it prepares society to accept far more aggressive systems next, systems that no longer adjust prices occasionally, but constantly, automatically, and without human oversight. The market did not become expensive by accident. It became personalized. And once pricing learns who you are, the old idea of a fair price is already gone. The system that allows prices to follow people instead of products did not appear overnight. Its foundation was laid decades earlier, when pricing was first untethered from public rules and handed to algorithms. The turning point was not artificial intelligence, it was deregulation. Before the late 1970s, major US industries operated under strict price controls. Airlines could not freely change fares. Routes, seat prices, and competition were regulated to maintain stability and fairness. A ticket had a published cost, and timing rarely mattered. That structure collapsed in 1978, when the Airline Deregulation Act removed federal control over fares and routes. With one signature, pricing stopped being a public constraint and became a private weapon. Once airlines were free to experiment, a new logic emerged. The question was no longer how to price a seat, but how to extract the most revenue from a fixed, perishable asset. An empty seat at takeoff was a permanent loss. That pressure gave birth to yield control systems, early algorithmic frameworks designed to squeeze value out of time, scarcity, and urgency. This was the first moment pricing became dynamic rather than static. American Airlines was among the earliest adopters, deploying automated systems that adjusted fares based on booking velocity, remaining seat inventory, and departure proximity. By the mid-1980s, internal reports showed revenue gains of roughly 6 to 8% purely from pricing optimization. No better planes, no more passengers, just math. By the end of the decade, nearly every major airline had implemented similar systems, permanently altering how prices behaved. This model introduced several ideas that still dominate pricing today. First, time sensitivity. The closer the deadline, the higher the price. Second, scarcity leverage. Fewer remaining units justify steeper increases. Third, segmentation. Business travelers booking late absorbed higher fares while early planners subsidized capacity. These mechanisms did not yet target individuals directly, but they trained markets to accept variability as normal. The success was impossible to ignore. By the early 1990s, the same logic spread outward. Hotels adopted centralized revenue management platforms that adjusted nightly rates based on projected occupancy and seasonal demand. Hilton, among the earliest movers, reported annual revenue per room increases of nearly 6% for multiple consecutive years after adopting automated pricing systems. In high-demand cities, empty room nights fell by double digits. The lesson was clear: price volatility worked. What mattered was not the industry, but the asset type. Any product that expired unused, hotel rooms, rental cars, train seats, was now governed by algorithms that constantly recalculated value. Prices stopped being statements of worth and became instruments of pressure. This normalized the idea that the same service could cost radically different amounts depending on timing, context, and perceived urgency. Crucially, these early systems operated without personal data. They responded to aggregate demand, not individual identity. Yet they established something far more important: consumer tolerance. People learned that prices move. They learned to expect increases as deadlines approached. They learned that hesitation carries a cost. This psychological conditioning is what made later transformations possible. By the late 1990s, dynamic pricing was no longer controversial. It was invisible. Industries framed it as efficiency, optimization, and better asset utilization. Regulators stepped back. Consumers adapted. What disappeared quietly during this period was the expectation of stability. Once prices could fluctuate freely without explanation, the moral framework of pricing weakened. This is the critical bridge to what comes next. Yield control proved that algorithms could outperform humans at pricing decisions. Deregulation proved companies could do this without oversight, and consumer adaptation proved resistance would be minimal. All that was missing was personalization. When commerce moved online, the structure built by deregulation did not need to be reinvented. It only needed to be aimed more precisely. The logic of yield control, maximize revenue from limited supply, was already accepted. The next step was to stop adjusting prices by seat or room and start adjusting them by screen. The blueprint was complete long before artificial intelligence entered the picture. AI didn't invent the system. It simply learned how to finish it. Once pricing systems were freed from regulation and trained to exploit time and scarcity, the final constraint was visibility. Yield control could only react to what it could observe: seats, rooms, calendars. What changed everything was e-commerce, because online markets introduced something physical markets never had: total behavioral surveillance. The moment shopping moved onto screens, every action became measurable. Pages viewed, time spent hovering, search repetition, comparison behavior, abandoned carts, and return frequency were no longer noise. They were signals. Between 2000 and 2010, the widespread adoption of cookies, account logins, IP tracking, and device identifiers transformed consumers into continuous data streams. Pricing no longer had to infer demand from crowds. It could model intent at the individual level. This is where algorithms learned how to watch. Early online retailers discovered that price sensitivity could be predicted with surprising accuracy. Someone who searched once behaved differently from someone who searched 5 times. Someone who compared tabs hesitated differently from someone who clicked buy immediately. These behaviors correlated strongly with willingness to pay. Pricing models began adjusting not to markets, but to probabilities of conversion. Large platforms tested this quietly. Around the year 2000, reports surfaced showing identical products displayed at different prices to different users. In documented cases, markups reached 6 to 10% for some buyers, while others saw lower prices for the same item at the same moment. Public explanations framed these as experiments, but the significance was deeper. Digital infrastructure had removed the need to announce price differences at all. No shelf labels, no witnesses, no friction. Academic research soon confirmed the pattern. Studies in the early 2000s recorded price variations ranging from 5% to 15% for identical products based solely on user behavior and location. The logic was simple. If an algorithm estimated a higher likelihood of purchase, the displayed price rose. If hesitation was detected, discounts appeared selectively. This was not random fluctuation, it was behavioral sorting. Unlike earlier pricing systems, these models did not rely on time pressure or inventory scarcity. They relied on psychological inference. The algorithm did not need to know who you were. It only needed to know how you behaved. That distinction matters. It allowed companies to argue neutrality while extracting personalized premiums. The system did not discriminate explicitly. It inferred. By the mid-2000s, this approach became structurally embedded. Retailers stopped thinking of prices as fixed outputs and started treating them as variables that could be optimized continuously. Revenue no longer depended only on volume. It depended on precision. A platform selling $10 billion annually could increase revenue by $500 million to $1.5 billion simply by improving its ability to predict who would tolerate higher prices. This shift also destroyed the traditional function of comparison shopping. When prices adjust per user, comparison loses meaning. The consumer believes they are evaluating options, but the algorithm is evaluating them. Transparency collapses asymmetrically. Sellers see everything. Buyers see only their own screen. What makes this stage uniquely dangerous is its silence. There are no receipts showing alternative prices, no proof that a different number existed. Every interaction feels normal in isolation. Yet across millions of transactions, the system steadily lifts the average cost borne by households without triggering resistance. This is the moment pricing stopped being reactive. It became observational. Algorithms learned not only how to respond to demand, but how to shape it by nudging users toward faster decisions, fewer comparisons, and higher acceptance thresholds. The act of watching became the act of pricing. That capability sets the psychological groundwork for what comes next. Once consumers accept invisible variation online, volatility becomes normalized. Price changes stop feeling suspicious and start feeling inevitable. When a number rises suddenly, the assumption is no longer manipulation. It is demand, timing, or luck. Once consumers accepted invisible variation online, the remaining barrier was emotional resistance. People still expected prices to feel stable in daily life. That resistance collapsed when platforms introduced a new rule. Prices could rise instantly without warning, and the increase itself would be framed as normal behavior. This is where surge pricing rewired expectations. Surge pricing did not just change costs, it changed psychology. Prices were no longer something you checked once and trusted. They became something you monitored, knowing delay could punish you. The system taught a simple lesson. Hesitation has a price. Speed is safety. Acceptance is cheaper than resistance. Ride-hailing platforms operationalized this logic at scale. Their algorithms monitored supply availability, request velocity, weather conditions, local events, traffic congestion, and time of day. When demand crossed a calculated threshold, prices multiplied automatically. In peak conditions, increases of 100% to 200% became common. What mattered was not the final number, but how quickly consumers learned to stop questioning it. The justification was efficiency. Higher prices were said to balance supply and demand by pulling more drivers onto the road. But internal and independent analyses showed a different outcome. Between 2022 and 2025, platform take rates in the United States rose sharply, moving from roughly 32% to 42%. That shift meant a larger share of each fare flowed upward, not outward. Prices rose faster than worker compensation. Optimization favored the platform, not equilibrium. This stage matters because it normalized volatility without explanation. Consumers were trained to accept that prices could change minute to minute, not because of inflation or cost inputs, but because an algorithm decided conditions justified it. Once that belief settled in, resistance faded. People stopped asking whether a price was fair and started asking whether waiting would make it worse. The financial impact was substantial. A common urban trip that cost about $50 in early 2020 began averaging $75 just a few years later, a 50% increase that far outpaced wage growth. Yet because the increase arrived gradually and unpredictably, it felt situational rather than structural. This is how normalization works. Sharp increases become background noise when they are fragmented. More importantly, surge pricing taught consumers that price instability was not an error. It was a feature. Screens refreshed, numbers changed, no apology followed. This broke a long-standing expectation that prices should be explainable. Instead, opacity became part of the transaction. This psychological conditioning created a critical bridge. Earlier systems adjusted prices by timing and inventory. Online commerce adjusted prices by observed behavior. Surge pricing added something new: emotional pressure, fear of missing out, fear of being stranded, fear of paying even more later. Those pressures shortened decision cycles and reduced scrutiny. Once consumers internalized this logic, they began to self-police. They rushed purchases, they accepted higher numbers preemptively, they blamed themselves for waiting too long. This self-attribution is powerful because it removes the need for persuasion. The system does not argue. It simply presents consequences. From an economic standpoint, this marked a turning point. Price volatility stopped being exceptional and became routine. Markets did not just tolerate dynamic pricing, they expected it. This acceptance unlocked far more aggressive models because algorithms could now raise prices without triggering backlash. The emotional groundwork had been laid. What followed was inevitable. If people accept sudden increases driven by conditions, they will accept increases driven by predictions. If they accept volatility as normal, they will accept personalization as invisible. Surge pricing did not need to know who you were. It only needed to teach you that prices move and that questioning them is futile. By the time advanced artificial intelligence entered pricing systems after 2020, resistance was already gone. Consumers had been trained to comply. The next evolution would not rely on demand spikes or crowded streets. It would rely on something far more precise, calculating your limit before you ever see the number. Once volatility became accepted, pricing no longer needed excuses. Artificial intelligence completed the transition by shifting from reacting to conditions to anticipating submission. This is where pricing stops moving with demand and starts moving with prediction. Modern AI pricing systems ingest thousands of signals simultaneously. Search frequency, cart behavior, device ecosystem, location data, time of day, and historical spending are fused into a single estimate. How high the number can go before a purchase fails. The displayed price is not calculated from costs. It is calculated from tolerance. The financial incentive is explicit. Consulting firms estimate AI-driven personalization can raise revenues by 10 to 15% across digital platforms. For a retailer processing $50 billion annually, that translates into $5 to $7.5 billion extracted without increasing wages, output, or quality. Precision replaces growth. These systems do not need certainty. They operate on probability. If an algorithm estimates a user will still convert at $118 instead of $104, the higher number appears. Device signals matter. Studies show users on premium smartphones routinely see prices 10 to 15% higher than those on lower-cost devices. Geography functions as an income proxy. Repeated searches trigger upward adjustments. Hesitation becomes a liability. The most destabilizing shift is scale. What once required human oversight now updates instantly across millions of users. Grocery delivery platforms have documented price differences of up to 23% for identical items shown at the same time. In some audits, over 70% of products displayed simultaneous variation. The market no longer has a shared reference point. At this stage, pricing is no longer a market signal. It is a sorting mechanism. The algorithm does not ask what a product is worth. It asks who you are, what you've revealed, and how much pressure you can absorb. Once that logic dominates, the ceiling on prices is no longer economic. It is psychological. Once algorithms can price by tolerance, the economy stops behaving like a market and starts operating like a filter. Prices no longer communicate value. They sort people. Access becomes conditional, invisible, and unequal by design. This system breaks the foundational assumption that competition protects consumers. When prices differ by individual, comparison collapses. Two households can spend thousands of dollars more each year for the same necessities without ever knowing it. If a family spends $45,000 annually on essentials, a personalized uplift of just 8 to 12% quietly extracts $3,600 to $5,400, not because costs rose, but because algorithms identified resilience. The shift accelerates inequality. Higher income signals trigger higher prices, while lower income users receive fewer options rather than fairer costs. Digital grocery shelves, dynamic delivery fees, and automated service pricing remove the last friction that once slowed price escalation. Major retailers deploying electronic shelf labels across 2,000-plus stores can now reprice tens of thousands of items in seconds. There is no cooling-off period, no human pause, only optimization. What disappears is accountability. Traditional inflation can be measured, debated, and regulated. Personalized pricing cannot. There is no posted standard to audit, no baseline to challenge. Every transaction becomes a private negotiation between a consumer and a system that knows far more than it reveals. Regulators chase averages while individuals absorb the extremes. Over time, trust erodes. Consumers no longer believe prices reflect reality. They believe prices reflect them. This shifts behavior in damaging ways. Rushed purchases, reduced mobility, delayed care, and chronic financial anxiety. When every decision feels like a trap, economic participation itself becomes stressful. The most dangerous consequence is normalization. Once people accept that fairness is no longer part of pricing, resistance fades. The system no longer needs to justify itself, it only needs data. Markets were once built on shared prices. They are now built on private limits. And when an algorithm decides what you can endure, the question is no longer how much things cost, but how much longer people can.